As America fights the wars of the 21st century, soldiers operate under extreme conditions, from high-altitude mountain ranges to vast stretches of desert, facing an enemy that employs unconventional tactics. To survive in these environments, troops rely on the training they receive back home. One of the most deployed divisions in the Army is based in the Northeast region of the United States. For over 2 decades, its soldiers have served in the First Gulf War, Hurricane Andrew relief in Florida, guarding UN workers in Somalia, restoring order in Haiti, overseeing the peace in Bosnia and Kosovo, and fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They are the 10th Mountain Division and are based in one of the most modern military installations in the world. From a rough-and-tumble cavalry camp started in the early years of the 20th century to the high-tech engineering marvel that it is today, its soldiers receive the best training to be able to respond rapidly anywhere in the world. That base is Fort Drum, New York, and this is the story of its first 100 years. Today, Fort Drum serves as one of the largest training installations in the United States east of the Mississippi River. Nearly 20,000 soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division call this base home, but it's also used for training by Reserve and National Guard troops from all over the Northeast and occasionally by British and Canadian soldiers. But the base was not always this way. The year is 1898, and America has declared war with Spain. U.S. forces are hastily assembled to invade the Spanish colony of Cuba. In the fight to capture the surrounding hills of the city stronghold of Santiago, Theodore Roosevelt, nicknamed Teddy, leads soldiers of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, called the Rough Riders, up San Juan Hill. The victory makes Roosevelt and the Rough Riders household names. The Spanish-American War ends in 4 months. Roosevelt returns home, and in 1901 he becomes the 26th President of the United States, following the assassination of President McKinley. During the war, Roosevelt observed that American forces were badly prepared for combat.
After the Spanish-American War, the United States military had learned some lessons from its experience. One of the lessons that they learned was that they needed to start integrating their units in training mode rather than waiting until they reached the battlefield.
Teddy set about to make up for the deficiencies. His plan is to set up 6 training camps, or as he calls them, concentration camps, at various sites around the country where regular Army troops and State Reserve militias will have established posts to train at.
Concentration camp meant that they'd concentrate regular troops and militia, so it's not what World War II called a concentration camp.
In order to make U.S. forces more organized, Congress passes a bill in 1903 that divides state militias into 2 classes. What will become the National Guard remains under state control, while the federal government will be in charge of the Army Reserves. This new arrangement, titled the Militia Act, will also be referred to as the Dick Law, after its sponsor, U.S. Senator Charles Dick of Ohio. The government in the next decade following the Militia Act of 1903 spends more money on the Guard and Reserves than it had in the previous 100 years on state militias. In 1906, the War Department sends commanders to the field to scout for usable locations to establish new training camps. In the Northeast, the task of locating a site falls to Colonel Philip Reed, commander of Madison Barracks, a U.S.-Canadian border post located in Sackett's Harbor, New York, still in use after the War of 1812. Colonel Reed, a veteran of the Civil War, attended West Point in 1864 and was commissioned a second lieutenant in 1867. Called the most expert signalman in the Army, he saw further service in the Plains Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War, where he served as Inspector General of the Volunteers in Cuba. After examining several possible sites throughout New York and Massachusetts, he favors a sandy scrubland with few inhabitants located in northern New York. Referred to by the locals as Pine Plains, the area has a good supply of fresh drinking water and terrain that's ideal for large-scale maneuvers.
Colonel Reed had come to know the Pine Plains, and he was the one that really pushed for the Pine Plains to be the new training site. Number one, because it was close. You wouldn't have to board trains to get there.
Reed recommends Pine Plains to the Department of the Army as an ideal training ground.
Colonel Reed, commanding officer of Madison Barracks, could probably be called the father of Fort Drum today.
Within weeks of hearing the Army's interest in developing the location as one of 6 national maneuver bases, the local Chamber of Commerce in the nearby city of Watertown, New York, quickly rallied support for the idea.
The Chamber of Commerce, what they were mostly interested in was 10,000 more customers coming into their stores. That was their biggest interest. So they were really the visionaries who saw that this was a good thing for Jefferson County.
An inspection team from the War Department arrives to review Pine Plains and hear from area leaders enthusiastic in support of the plan.
It was the Watertown Chamber of Commerce that actually jumped in and immediately started securing purchase options on all the land they could find out there, and they were the ones that convinced the Army that they could make this work.
Landowners offered to sell 20,000 acres to the War Department for $400,000, a figure the government is not willing to spend. The project is failing before it has a chance to begin. However, a group of prominent citizens, including several representatives of the New York Central Railroad, can see the potential of having troops transported and stationed in the area. The group takes an interest in discussing options for the project, figuring that landowners, whose price is too high for the War Department, will be willing to lower the amount for locals. Negotiations are just beginning. One newspaper editorial put the question this way: why do we want the soldiers up there? They have money to spend. Labor Day weekend, 1907. A grand military display is arranged by New York State in an effort to demonstrate the suitability of Pine Plains for mock warfare. Much of the land considered by the Army is leased by the National Guard for 2 weeks. Trains ferry over 3,500 men to the area, temporarily named Camp Hughes in honor of New York State Governor Charles Hughes. On Governor's Day, nearly 4,000 visitors attend the pomp and circumstance, including Governor Hughes, who's impressed by the unit review and parade. General James Lloyd, commanding the National Guard troops, remarks to the local newspaper.
It is possible that a permanent camp may be established here, but it's not probable. If the property owners keep raising the price of the land as they've already done, then it would be a case of having killed the goose that laid the golden egg.
While military maneuvers are taking place on Pine Plains, maneuvers are also continuing behind the scenes to purchase the property. New York Congressman Charles Knapp and James "Sonny Jim" Sherman come on board and push for Congress to approve the purchase of the land at Pine Plains. In early 1908, Knapp telegraphs the Watertown newspaper from Washington with a bit of good news.
The War Department has decided to have a concentration camp for United States troops under command of General Frederick Grant at Pine Plains this coming summer. The camp will continue from June 15th to July 15th. The troops to include infantry, cavalry, and field artillery in number about 6,000.
Although the regular Army is now planning on training at Pine Plains, the property will be leased, not purchased. Following the announcement of the upcoming training, a glowing assessment of Pine Plains appears in a New York Times article during February of 1908.
Pine Plains in Jefferson County, New York, will be the scene next summer of the biggest and most imposing military encampment ever held in this part of the United States. The Pine Plains maneuvers, said Colonel Henry O.S. Heaston, Adjutant General of the Department of the East, are regarded in this department as the very culmination of the training of our regular Army and the militia forces of the states concerned. I do not believe there is any location in this country which is so accessible without additional expenditure for railroad trackage as the property in question, being surrounded as it is by railroads, all within easy walking distance of the plains where the troops will maneuver. In addition, Pine Plains is near the United States military post from which troops will be ordered, lying as it does practically in a central location so far as Forts Porter, Niagara, and Ontario, Madison Barracks, Plattsburgh, and Fort Ethan Allen are concerned.
The Watertown Chamber of Commerce continues negotiations with landowners and by the summer of 1908 arrives at a deal to buy nearly 11,000 acres, over half of the proposed area. The estimated price is $55,000, but the deal's not done yet. The government will make the final decision. June 1908. While negotiations to buy the property continue, the War Department leases Pine Plains for a month of maneuvers. It will be the first time that regular Army soldiers use the land for training. Over 3,000 troops arrive. Many have marched a distance of up to 250 miles to get there. Columns of soldiers and cavalry accompanied by horse-drawn freight wagons travel through many upstate New York communities. In addition, about 8,000 National Guard and Reserve troops from the New England and Mid-Atlantic states will rotate through the encampment over the 4 weeks. Commanding the training operation is Major General Frederick Dent Grant. Son of President Ulysses Grant, he's commander of the Eastern Division. Frederick had been introduced to the military early in his life, having followed his father on the Vicksburg campaign in the Civil War at age 12, where he was wounded in the leg by a Confederate bullet.
He was an 1871 graduate of West Point. He'd actually left the Army, became police commissioner of New York City, and then rejoined the Army during the Spanish-American War.
Grant has been a supporter of the development of a maneuver base in the Northeast, and now he'll get to test it out.
A glorious new record for the regular Army. It shows that if necessary, the Army can be drawn from all sections of the country and assembled in a common camp in absolutely scheduled time.
The majority of the soldiers arrived by train, transported by the New York Central Railroad, who has established a station on the line between the nearby villages of Carthage and Philadelphia, known as Pine Camp. The name will stick. General Grant's headquarters, with the tents for his staff officers and the umpires in the war games, is placed on a 200-foot-high prominence called Hog Hill, or the Hog's Back. This position has a commanding view over the tent city of the troops, the corrals for the horses and mules, and much of the maneuver area. The soldiers suffer a rough start to their training exercise when on one of the first afternoons a windstorm strikes the camp, accompanied by rain and hail. The wind is estimated at 60 miles per hour and knocks down virtually every tent in the camp, injuring a number of soldiers. Grant's tent on the Hog's Back is knocked down around him, along with the tents of his staff officers. The camp paymaster, Major William Halliday, is handing out pay to one of the infantry units. He has approximately $25,000 in $1, $2, $5, and $10 denominations when the wind lifts the tent away, scattering the money everywhere. The search goes on into the night, with some of it turning up over 500 yards away. It's not known how much is recovered. When troops are not running after escaping money, they eat, and they eat a lot. Close to 40,000 loaves of bread per week, 6,000 pounds of meat, and 3,000 pounds of vegetables daily, along with 14,000 pounds of ice. Most of the needed supplies are purchased locally, including a contract with a bakery for extra bread. Some of the individuals getting a slice of the pie are local peddlers who often travel through camp selling fresh produce and merchandise. One of the more colorful camp followers of the time is a character known as Huckleberry Charlie. Charles Sherman is an eccentric peddler that knows every inch of the Pine Camp area, picking milk pails full of blueberries and selling them to troops from his wagon pulled by his horse, Black Maggie.
He would get in the way of the maneuvers occasionally. Uninvited, of course. Visited with everybody, and he'd wear different kinds of costumes, you might say.
Dressing in wildly mismatched jackets, hats, and ties, he can be heard hawking his wares.
We pick 'em with a silver spoon, and we don't pick 'em till they're ripe. They're free of sticks, stones, stems, or bruises. Some are black, some are blue. Come, kind people, and purchase a few, for this is my last time through. Get your huckleberries.
One item soldiers will not be able to spend money on is alcohol. Commander Grant often participates in temperance gatherings outside of his official duties, and he brings that policy to Pine Camp, placing a ban of all intoxicants.
I have not a drop of anything in my tent, and I expect that to be the case in every tent in this encampment, both among the regulars and the guard forces. Any regular who breaks this rule will be punished to the limit of military law.
On the field, units engage in various warfare evolutions, such as advance, rear, and flank guard movements, with one side posing as the Blues and the opposing force as the Browns. Cavalry and infantry units act in coordinated movements to surprise or dislodge the opposition. Artillerymen practice their trade as they limber up their guns and move them into firing positions on the sandy and moss-covered regions of Pine Camp. Units practice digging trenches and securing the bridge over the nearby Black River at Great Bend. During the maneuvers, a new technical innovation is tested. 2 automobiles, manufactured for military purposes, are put through their paces as a means of Army transportation. One car is road tested, making the trip from New York City to Pine Camp some 190 miles in a record 9 hours. In the final analysis, the officer's report states the automobile is practically useless for military purposes, especially after it fails to climb the Hogsback Hill at Pine Camp. Governor Charles Hughes returns for a visit of the New York Guard troops. He's driven by automobile around camp with General Grant, observing parade drills and artillery practice. The training goes off with few injuries. One private from the New York City area is injured when he falls off from a gun carriage and is run over, but he's able to return to New York City with his unit. When the mock battles are over and the troops return home, some voices complain of the wind and dust at Pine Camp. In fact, the Army does not return the following year, but holds their Northeast maneuvers in Massachusetts. The 1908 War Games had been generous to the local economy near Pine Camp. One estimate had enlisted men spending $20,000 in the community, while the Army Quartermaster and Commissary departments tripled that amount. On top of that were the expenditures of the Officer Corps. Local businessmen and officials are uncertain about the troops returning for maneuvers and the future of Pine Camp. In a short time, their questions will be answered. February 1909. Congress passes an appropriation bill for military maneuvers. Not included once again, funding to purchase the land at Pine Camp. On the 26th of the month, Congressman Knapp and Congressman Sherman, longtime supporters of the development of the training camp, argue into the early morning hours on Capitol Hill, attempting to persuade Congress to approve their request. Finally, their persistence pays off. $75,000 is approved to purchase the land at Pine Camp, and on March 4th, President Roosevelt signs the bill into law. Pine Camp becomes a permanent maneuver ground for federal troops. The final purchase amount for the land, over $62,000, or just under 11,000 acres. Ironically, a few months after the purchase, a report's issued by a board of Army officers appointed to review the 1908 maneuvers. It brings up serious deficiencies for Pine Camp as a training site. The report praises the area for its abundant water supply and lack of insects, but complains of dust clouds, frequent windstorms, and lack of adequate railroad facilities. The report opposes buying the site, but has been released too late to affect the purchase of Pine Camp. Apparently, General Grant considers the site fine for Army purposes, as he plans to return for maneuvers in 1910.
The New York Times, July 18, 1910. The first of a dozen special trains which will be needed to take the Manhattan soldiers to Pine Camp will leave Grand Central Station a week from next Friday. The regiments will reach camp in Jefferson County by Sunday afternoon on July 31st. They are the 12th, 69th, and 71st Regiments of Infantry, the 22nd Engineers, Squadron A, and the 1st Company of the Signal Corps. These troops will number between 4,000 and 5,000 officers and men and will be the biggest detachment of soldiers ever sent out of New York City in time of peace.
Once again, soldiers from across the Northeast descend on Pine Camp. By July 31st, 1910, the canvas tent city extends nearly 2 miles out in front of the ridge, known as the Hogsback, on which General Grant's headquarters is positioned. Maneuvers get underway with opposing forces, categorized as the Red Army, versus other units labeled the Blue Army. Soldiers are supplied with blank ammunition to heighten the sense of battle, and soon numerous engagements are being fought at different locations across Pine Camp. In one spot, 600 troops attempt to take a bridge over the nearby Black River at the village of Great Bend, named for the curve in the riverbed at that location. There, vendors selling lunches to soldiers and citizens from the backs of wagons are scattered by the sound of popping rifle blasts as the fighting overruns their position. Another battle being fought is with the multitude of liquor shacks that have sprung up around the camp perimeter, stocked with Pine Camp's special whiskey, which advertising signboards tout as 10 years old, absolutely pure, and bottled from the wood. The liquor shacks draw the attention of General Grant and his officers, who inform proprietors about a little-known law forbidding the sale of whiskey within a mile of military encampments in New York State. He promises action on any shop where disorder might erupt. Among the soldiers taking part in the maneuvers, 2 African-American units, including the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry, known for their fighting in the Plains Indians Wars. Mirroring the society of the time, these men are segregated in their own areas of the camp. Racial problems are not long in breaking out. A clash erupts when officers and men of a white Brooklyn company refuse to use the same shower baths as black units. They send a request to General Grant asking for other arrangements and soon are accommodated. Racism is not the only storm brewing. Within the first week of the encampment, a 40-mile-an-hour wind, drenching rain, and unseasonably cold temperatures plagued the soldiers and canceled operations for a day. It's a replay of the Windstorm of 1908, except this time the tents are more solidly anchored and don't blow over. Although the tents stay anchored, the cost of feeding the soldiers does not, and increases from 19 cents to 25 cents per person each day. The figure is compared to the previous 1908 maneuvers. It's pointed out the men are offered 3 kinds of meat, all the vegetables they can eat, fresh baked bread, pickles, tea, and coffee. A commissary officer notes,
"That's pretty fine living for men under combat conditions. If we feed them much better than this, we'll put the summer hotels out of business."
By the end of August 1910, the summer training is over. And for General Frederick Grant, it will be his last trip to Pine Camp. He dies in April of 1912 of throat cancer at age 61, killed by the same illness that claimed his father, Ulysses. At Pine Camp, yearly summer maneuvers continue.
Essentially, it's a summer training area. They have a few permanent buildings, but mostly it's a tent city. They set up every spring, and then they'll have troops come in for the training year. And then about August and September, when the weather starts to change, they go back home.
1914, the First World War engulfs Europe. Back in the U.S., the War Department begins conducting rigorous training to prepare troops for possible involvement in the conflict. It's during this time at Pine Camp that one of the largest horse stampedes in Army history takes place. On September 5, 1917, more than 400 horses belonging to a field artillery unit break out of their corrals and terrorize the nearby countryside for miles. The horses were kept in a post and wire enclosure and had been fed for the night. Something spooked the animals, sending them crashing through several of the corrals. A sentry is knocked down, but not seriously hurt. The horses charge through the encampment, and soldiers scramble to safety and surround other corrals to keep the breakout from spreading. Troops mount up in automobiles to attempt a chase and recovery operation. The horses stampede into the nearby village of DeFerriot, where they overrun an automobile traveling on the state highway. Driving the car with his family is B.J. Minear, manager of the New York Air Brake Company, one of the largest industries in the region.
They came at me head-on, and as they leaped on my car, my family leaped out from the opposite side. They ran to the woods for safety. I stayed at the wheel. It seemed that about every other horse leaped onto my machine, and as the first animal struck it, he leaped onto the fender and stuck his head right through the windshield. Fortunately, he drove all the glass away from my face, but his head came right through and right beside my head. Other horses leaped with their feet on the running board, while others dashed through over the radiator and landed with their front feet on the top of the car, crushing it in.
Another car is wrecked near the village of Black River, turned over on top of a horse which had been trampled to death. Several more of the animals are killed when struck down by a New York Central passenger train. In one town, the herd collides with a buggy, breaking a woman's leg and knocking a 10-year-old boy to the ground, who's forced to run with the horses for more than a quarter mile to avoid being trampled. He's finally able to make his way to the side of the road and escape the danger with no serious injuries. In the city of Watertown, police chase down much of the herd as they pour through Public Square in the city center. Captured runaways are taken to a nearby stable. Some horses make it as far as 70 miles away. The stampede ends with no person seriously hurt, but many unanswered questions. The officer, whose horses had broken free, is unable to say what caused the uproar.
Well, I've been in the Army 23 years. I never saw anything like it. I've seen horses in herd stampede, but nothing like this. Some little thing frightened them terribly, and it spread to the others. The horses were all new and had only recently been purchased by the Army.
As World War I continues to be fought overseas, the government can see that the use of airplanes is becoming a military necessity, and an airfield is constructed at Pine Camp. Several buildings, including hangars, are erected to support 2 squadrons with up to 150 men. Aircraft become a regular part of the maneuvers every year. Arriving for training at Pine Camp Saturday, July 2, 1927, are 8 Curtiss JN-4s, nicknamed Jennies. The aircraft with the 27th Division Army Air Service are from Staten Island in New York City. It's planned to be routine air maneuvers, however, it'll be far from that. On Wednesday, July 6th, around midday, Pilot Lieutenant Carl Sack and observer Captain Curtis Wheeler fly their plane low over the camp, dropping messages to troops in the field. Lieutenant Sack, age 26, is planning to get married soon after the 2-week maneuvers are over. Suddenly, their plane unexpectedly drops out of the sky from about 200 feet, crashing near Hog's Back Hill. Both men are killed, Wheeler at the scene, and Sack in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The official inquiry finds that it's an unaccountable accident that had occurred in the line of duty with no fault or neglect on the part of any personnel. Both Wheeler and Sack will not be forgotten. The next year, the airfield at Pine Camp is named Wheeler-Sack Field in commemoration of the 2 flyers. Today, their names continue at the Fort Drum Airfield as a lasting tribute. In 1935, the War Department plans to conduct the largest peacetime maneuvers ever held in the country. Several years before, as declassified records from 1974 indicate, the United States Army Intelligence Division, called G2, conceives a war plan to deal with world powers and neighboring countries. One part, known as the Joint Army and Navy Basic War Plan, RED, looks at a hypothetical invasion of Canada. In February of 1935, the War Department goes before Congress to appropriate $57 million to build 3 northern border air bases that can be used in preemptive strikes on Canadian airfields. These plans do not necessarily refer to the airfield at Pine Camp. The request, intended to be kept secret from the public, might have passed unnoticed except for an entry published by mistake in the Congressional Record. The report ends up on the front page of the New York Times, May 1, 1935. The episode something of an embarrassment for Uncle Sam, but despite downplaying the report, the U.S. goes ahead with plans to conduct large military maneuvers only 20 miles south of the Canadian border at Pine Camp, New York. 3 months after the New York Times article appears, 36,000 soldiers participate in exercises pitting opposing forces in a scenario featuring a motorized invasion of Canada. The training operations are an effort to revitalize a diminished army, reduced after the end of the First World War and suffering the effects of the Great Depression. Army units are now low in personnel, often at half their operational strength. Privates see their pay cut to $18 a month. In an effort to improve Army readiness, General Douglas MacArthur, recently appointed Army Chief of Staff, is the driving force in the training being conducted at Pine Camp.
MacArthur took a look at the United States Army as it stood in the early 1930s and realized that we were pretty woefully deficient. And he also saw things happening in Europe and recognized that a big war was going to break out at some point in the future, and of course he was right. MacArthur wanted to do larger training and more advanced preparation.
Trains transport soldiers from all over the Northeast, arriving every 15 minutes at stations in the area. In addition, nearly 500 automobiles, mostly taxicabs, are commissioned by the Army to move troops at a cost estimated at $120,000.
That would give you an idea of how unprepared the country was militarily. If they had to go to war, would you want to call a cab? I don't think so.
In the nearby city of Watertown, 1,500 military vehicles following the main road northward clog the streets as truck convoys, ambulances, gun carriages, and tanks arrive. In charge of the operation is 1st Army Commander General Dennis Nolan, who establishes his headquarters at a stone hotel near the crossroads of Great Bend, just across the nearby Black River from Pine Camp. The hotel is still there today. As the massive exercise gets underway, mock battles extend into 3 counties of upstate New York and give the press and public a preview of how mechanized warfare will be fought for real in the not-too-distant future.
By that time they had tanks, they had integrated tank maneuvers, infantry maneuvers, field artillery maneuvers, Air Corps, Signal Corps, Hospital Corps. They were all integrated in that training exercise.
Units are categorized as red and blue forces, serving as opposing armies. Soldiers are equipped with blank ammunition, around 500,000 rounds, to give the war games more realism. One of the largest battles of the exercise is on August 24th. Out of a rising curtain of white smoke laid down by low-flying planes, a handful of Christie tanks, named after their inventor, emerge from the woods, moving quickly across pasture land, plowing down barbed wire fences as they go. The tanks advance upon Hill 300, where the Green Mountain Boys of the 43rd Division are dug in. The infantrymen open fire with rifles and machine guns, their blank cartridges having the same effect on the tanks as real bullets would. Up the base of the hill, the tanks advance, trailing torn strands of barbed wire and forcing the dug-in troops along the high ground to fall back. The battle is over and war game umpires declare an armistice for the day. The tanks prove very effective. What is not a success are soldiers avoiding damaging private property leased for the maneuvers. One article from the 1935 Infantry Journal describes an incident.
Troops were instructed to exercise the utmost care in protecting private property. Almost everyone played the game, but there were a few exceptions. a machine gun platoon approached a 4-strand barbed wire fence and by dint of much sweat and labor, hoisted the whole works over the wall. At the risk of tearing the sheets out of their breeches, all hands crawled through. At this point, a lone straggler, a private, appeared on the scene. From his pocket he drew a pair of wire cutters, neatly snipped the 4 strands of wire, went through the gap, and hastened to join his disappearing platoon, all with perfect nonchalance.
For the most part, the exercises go off without a hitch and draw thousands of civilian spectators from around the area. They crowd highways to rubberneck at the troop formations and equipment. One night, onlookers are able to watch a night bombing attack on the headquarters at Great Bend near Pine Camp.
They'd have searchlights, and the crowds of people from the area would go up there and observe those airplanes dropping flares and different things.
Several regular Army and National Guard aircraft drop different colored flares for their bomb loads, while sound locators, the Army's big ears, pick up their approach and direct searchlight beams across the sky and pick out aerial targets. Several batteries of 3-inch guns and 50 caliber machine guns fire blanks and powder wadding skyward in a show of noise and lights. For one pilot, it will be his last maneuver. After flying through the searchlight and anti-aircraft gun display, Lieutenant Robert Scherer attempts to return to the city of Watertown Airport, where a number of Army aircraft are based during the operation. As his plane flies over the southern boundary of the camp, his engine stalls. Along for the ride is mechanic George White, who parachutes to safety. Scherer is not so lucky. In an apparent attempt to control his plane, he waits too long to bail out, falling to his death after his parachute fails to open in time. Although the training operations are viewed favorably, they bring to attention many deficiencies in the modernization of the Army, a lack of military vehicles for transport, an insufficient number of tanks, and a shortage of officers and enlisted men. On top of this is a shortage of ammunition and outdated aircraft. Also, the need is seen for more large-scale training maneuvers to get various units working in a cohesive manner.
They realized that we have a long way to go. And really beginning in 1935 with the maneuvers here at Pine Camp, the United States Army starts the road that will eventually get them to World War II.
Following the 1935 maneuvers, the Army continues to grow, and so does Pine Camp. By June of 1939, it's been enlarged by thousands of acres. Around this time, a training operation is conducted, but not at Pine Camp. It is at the Plattsburgh Military Reserve, another large maneuver site in northern New York, where around 20,000 soldiers are involved in mock battles that extend into neighboring counties. In charge of the war games is the new 1st Army Commander, Lieutenant General Hugh A. Drum. Born in 1879, Drum became a second lieutenant in the 12th Infantry Regiment at age 19 after he graduated from Boston College. He served 3 tours of duty in the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century, winning a Silver Star for bravery in battle. He also participated in the occupation of Veracruz, Mexico in 1914. Drum jumped on the promotional fast track, becoming Assistant Chief of Staff to General Blackjack Pershing in World War I. In 1918, he was promoted to Colonel and became Chief of Staff of the American Expeditionary Force in Europe during World War I. In the 1920s, he was assigned to the War Department in Washington, where he clashed with air power advocate Colonel Billy Mitchell, who was attempting to create a separate command for the Army Air Corps. Drum testified against Mitchell at his famous court-martial in 1925, ending his career and leading to the continued control of the Air Corps by Ground Force Command. Hugh Drum was promoted to Major General in 1931 and sent to Honolulu as commander of the U.S. Army Pacific Hawaiian Command. He was in line for the Army Chief of Staff post in 1939, but was passed over for the younger General George Marshall. At this time, Drum was advanced to the rank of Lieutenant General while in command of the 1st Army. It is Hugh Drum who initiates the next set of maneuvers at Pine Camp. The year is 1940. World War II rages in Europe. General Drum states that
an urgent requirement exists for the organization of an adequate field army.
He puts his staff to work, planning extensive war games that cover an area of 1,300 square miles of northern New York. 81 special troop trains arrive from 12 states and the District of Columbia, deploying 38,000 soldiers from Pine Camp to Plattsburgh Military Reserve. Radio traffic bulletins are broadcast, warning people to avoid the roads around congested military areas as convoys move men and material. Live fire exercises are conducted at Pine Camp with artillery, anti-aircraft, and machine gun fire. The operation is part of a national exercise occurring in 5 locations throughout the U.S. This leads to a shortage of equipment for some units taking part in the maneuvers. Infantrymen train with broomsticks while trucks stand in for tanks. The 1st Army Headquarters issues a decree that any weapons not delivered to troops in the field may be simulated by such means as may be adopted by division commanders. General Drum expresses his frustration with the situation by saying,
Germany went through a similar training experience with wooden guns and mock equipment 7 years ago. I will have plenty to say about this a little later.
In the United States, it's becoming obvious that a war with the Axis powers is inevitable.
By then, the United States Army realized World War II, we're going to get involved in it. There's no question about that. We're not prepared. We need more training installations. We need bigger training installations.
The War Department decides to enlarge the Pine Camp training site to become a home for a new Army division, suggested by a report from General Hugh Drum. Construction of the base gets underway in the fall of 1940. The main cantonment area is built as a virtual city for housing troops with 800 buildings on some 2,500 acres. Included are barracks, warehouses, administrative buildings, fire stations, chapels, theaters, officers' quarters, recreation halls, and even a hospital. Miles of new roads are constructed leading into and around the post. The cost of the construction balloons from $6 million to $20 million, a huge amount in 1940 currency. The expansion brings a boom to the local economy.
I know of many people who were unemployed, and that gave them employment.
A truck would come around to the community and say, have you got a hammer when you want to work today? And they would just collect people to come and work on these buildings because, again, they had this important job to do. They needed all these barracks, and folks just came around and they hired them right on the spot.
I was 16 years old. I worked in the housing area that the military was coming into. From there, I worked up on the airport as a laborer. What we was doing cutting trees was lowering the trees like at an angle for when the planes took off.
The work employs more than 6,000 people with a monthly payroll of $300,000. The buildings constructed during this period are considered temporary and only expected to last from 5 to 10 years. Today, many of them are still in use more than a half-century later. Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall admits that the construction of the Pine Camp Cantonment is an especially fine example of good planning and execution. But there is a downside to the buildup. As the base adds 84,000 additional acres, many nearby villages and farms now find themselves located inside the maneuver range. The federal government informs residents in the area they'll need to move and employs the largest use of eminent domain in New York State history to take the land. The locals have no choice in the matter. Nearly 2,000 people whose families had lived on the land for generations will lose their homes and businesses.
My dad had 2 farms on the camp, and he figured he was set for life until they told us we're going to have to move.
Some of the farmers were really glad because they thought, gee, I can get something better, better land. And some of them that been in for generations, they hated to move.
There were a lot of embittered people.
More than 3,000 buildings, 24 schools, 6 churches, and a post office will soon be abandoned. Entire hamlets and villages, including Laraysville, Sterlingville, Woods Mills, Lewisburg, Alpena, and North Wilna, will be erased off the map. Major General Irving Phillips in comments,
"The Army industry will be one of the greatest things this section has known for 150 years. This will be a permanent industry. We are not destroying the past, but rather creating the future."
Put in charge of the resettlement process is the Farm Security Administration. a Depression-era agency providing financial help for those affected. The government allocates more than $2 million to buy property and for other relocation expenses. Landowners are provided an appraised value for their assets, with little say in the process.
You just took whatever they said it was worth. Now, if you want to sell a farm, you say, well, I want so much. You couldn't do it that way. Take it or leave it. You're still going to move.
Most residents accept the buyout as offered and voluntarily move. Others hold out for the hope of better terms, while a few refuse to cooperate at all. For 31 years, Mrs. Minnie Appenzeller had lived in Lorraysville. She expresses her feelings of helplessness.
I'd never move of my own accord, but if the government must have the land, there's nothing we can do about it.
Farmers auction off herds of dairy cattle and machinery while others pack their belongings, preparing to leave their homes before receiving payments for their properties. Like scenes from the Depression-era Dust Bowl in the Midwest, lines of trucks, tractors, hay wagons, and private cars, each bearing farm implements and household goods, begin pouring out of the area.
I was 7 years old when moving day came. 7 milk trucks pulled into our yard, and cattle were loaded on 6 of them, and our household was loaded on the 7th one.
2 Farm Security Administration photographers, Jack Delano and Arthur Rothstein, arrived to document the resettlement. Their photographs of the event now live on as part of the collection in the Library of Congress. Despite a shortage of trucks, most families moved by the September 1, 1941 deadline. People are forced to resettle with no money yet paid by the government for their land. By October 1st, almost 30 families are still living in their homes, having made no plans to resettle. But by mid-month, all have moved. To add insult to injury, some residents who vacate their homes early return for a last look and find their property vandalized. Doors, windows, plumbing, and furnaces are stolen. Police and Army officials promise better security in the affected areas, while landowners wait for the government to take title to their properties. The majority of landowners are paid within months, while others wait years before receiving money for their assets. Some battle through 12 years of court proceedings to get paid, while a few people may never have received any payment.
If they didn't fight the system, then they got their checks fairly rapidly. But if they fought the system and didn't agree with the amount being paid, then it was drug out in the courts for years and years and years afterwards.
The way they paid it off and stuff like that, I don't think that was very well thought of at all.
I remember my grandfather on my mother's side was heartbroken because he was in his 70s, and they always said he died of a broken heart because he didn't live too long after he moved. And it was hard for the older folks to adapt. Most of them just felt that they were being evicted. It took my dad many, many years before he admitted he was better off, better land where he moved to than it was up there.
Eventually, people adjust to their new lives and surroundings. For years afterward, the people of the lost villages gather for summer reunions to reminisce about their earlier life. Only a handful are alive now who were but children at the time of the relocation. For these people, the memories of their childhood homes are kept alive by occasional visits to the remains of building foundations scattered through the woods of Fort Drum.
What's left today, for the most part, are ruins. You can go there today and still see the foundations, the cellar holes, the cemeteries.
The visitors to these villages, and especially the ones who remember losing their homes there, have been really inspiring for us. It's moving to stand in a location like this where I've only ever known it as rubble in the woods, and to talk with a couple who are looking in the woods and they're imagining a church, and they're turning to me and pointing and saying, we were married here. And you realize that in their mind's eye, it's a living, thriving community, and they're remembering it as it was when everybody still lived there and everything was still standing and it was filled with life.
The thing I remember the most, I think, was Truman Cool. Truman lived on the farm not far from here. He was a great baseball player. Oh, really great player. He could hit the ball a country mile. He was a different kind of guy. He'd sit down with the young kids like myself and ask how you're doing and talk to you about things, and it made you feel like you were somebody. And turned out he was really somebody, because he went in the military and he fought for his country. Yeah, Truman died at Anzio Beachhead in Italy during the war. And the people at Fort Drum should be very proud of Truman. He was a good boy.
One home from the lost village of Loraysville still exists, the Loray Mansion, built by French landowner and nobleman James Loray de Chameau in 1827. Described as a miniature Versailles, one historian called it the most splendid establishment west of the Hudson. Among the guests entertained there by Loray, President James Monroe and Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Over time, the building became run down, but was partially restored by the last civilian owners before the government acquired it in the 1941 expansion. It fell into disuse for several decades again, but over the years it's been repaired and maintained, serving as officers' quarters. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. With the arrival of the 10th Mountain Division in 1985, a proper restoration has continued into the present, with the acquisition of furnishings and decorations befitting its age. The property is now used to house guests at Fort Drum. As the expansion of Pine Camp progresses in 1941, it becomes home to a new Army unit. The 4th Armored Division is activated April 15th. It's formed from men from the 1st Armored Division from Fort Knox, Kentucky, who are sent in a cadre of 600 officers and 3,200 enlisted men to the upstate New York base.
I arrived up here in March at the railroad station there in Black River. They trucked us over to Pine Camp.
They are the first to occupy the new barracks going up on post.
We were assigned 60 men per barracks. I was put on guard duty one night and the temperature went down to 30 below. It was pretty chilly, and I had on all the parkers and liners and gloves and boots I could have on, and still it was very, very cold.
Under command of Major General Henry Baird, the 4th Armored begins training for the first 6 months with only 20 tanks, all that is available for the time being. They are light M2 and M3 Stuart tanks equipped with machine guns and a 37mm cannon.
There wasn't much room, and sort of hard to get in, real tight fit. And we used a cartridge, a blank cartridge like a big shotgun shell to start them. But visibility was, I think, was very poor.
In charge of training tank crews in one of the 4th Armored Regiments is a 1936 graduate of West Point. Captain Creighton Abrams serves as assistant commander of the 7th Armored Regiment, later to become the 37th Armored Regiment, soon to make a name for itself in the battle for Europe. Abrams, his wife Julie, and their 2 children move into a house just outside of Pine Camp in the village of Black River. As the training gets underway, Abrams, known as Abe, is given only 1 tank to train the entire regiment and finds clever ways to practice.
He had to train tank crews to be able to work together as a tank crew with no tanks. Obviously, that's a pretty daunting challenge. That's a tough job. Here's how Abrams solved that. Abrams actually had the 4-man tank crew. They'd all form up. The driver would be to the left front, and the commander would be to the right rear, and the loader and the gunner. And they would actually hold on to each other's shoulders, and they'd maneuver around the base using tank commands.
Going through formations called the wedge, line, and echelon. Using jeeps to fill in for tanks, crews maneuver them in formation as a platoon. Another officer in the 4th Armored, Bruce Clark, observed Abrams training his men with jeeps and later remarked,
"I don't remember that anyone else did that. They all sat around and waited for the tanks to arrive."
There's even a saying to joke about the wait for armor to arrive.
Tanks is tanks, and tanks is dear. There shall be no tanks this year.
By late fall of 1941, the wait is over. Trainloads of light and medium armor arrive, including the M3 Grant tank. Arriving at the base is a new test vehicle called an Aqua Cheetah, built by the Amphibian Car Company of Buffalo, New York. Its capabilities are shown off as it crosses the nearby Black River through high water. It is not the only testing to be conducted. The division develops new techniques for operating in sub-zero temperatures and in deep snow. In February 1942, a tank unit sets out on a 6-day trial in brutal winter conditions, traveling for 30 miles and existing without buildings for shelter. They work on tactical problems involving a roadblock, maneuver vehicles on uncertain ground, and conduct live fire exercises in sub-zero weather. As the training continues, the United States, now at war with Germany, Japan, and Italy, builds up its armed forces, and it is inevitable that the 4th Armored Division will play a role in the conflict. After spending 16 months at Pine Camp, the 4th Armored moves to Tennessee for maneuvers and eventually is sent to Europe. The division gains fame while serving under General George S. Patton in his dash across France and into Germany with the 3rd Army. It's during this time that the now Colonel Creighton Abrams, in charge of the 37th Armored Regiment, leads in his Sherman tank nicknamed Thunderbolt a breakthrough of the German encirclement of Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge to relieve the 101st Airborne. General Patton, with his usual modesty, remarks of Abrams.
I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He's the world champion.
Abrams would go on to become overall commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, replacing General William Westmoreland in 1968. He was named Army Chief of Staff in 1972 and served 2 years in the post before dying of cancer in 1974. The U.S. M1 Abrams main battle tank is perhaps the most lasting tribute to this remarkable warrior. Shortly after the 4th Armored Division leaves Pine Camp, another unit takes its place. The 45th Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbirds, are drawn from National Guard units in the Southwest.
The United States Army knew that the 45th Infantry Division, who had been called up for federal service pretty early, they knew they were going to go to Europe. But they took a look at these guys and said, these guys are from New Mexico and Arizona. You know, they're going to go to Europe. It snows, it's winter. They need to get some experience in this kind of bad weather conditions. So the Army decided to send them up, I think as a cruel joke, to Pine Camp. They arrive here in November 1942. A very hard winter, 42, 43. There's already snow on the ground. There's over 50-some inches of snow in December. In January 1943, there's a series of blizzards that sweep across the North Country that dump, amazing amounts of snow. These poor guys are just absolutely miserable.
Among the soldiers, a young cartoonist named Bill Malden. In his autobiography, The Brass Ring, he describes his experiences while stationed at Pine Camp.
We learned to dig foxholes in ice. Never saw the actual ground there. And how to survive in 30 below weather with brisk winds across nearby Lake Ontario, driving the frost factor down to about 80 below. As I recall, the technique was to burrow into a snowdrift, pull up your collar, shudder violently until relieved by a replacement. It seemed wasteful to send a whole division such a distance to learn shivering.
It is at Pine Camp that Bill's skills develop as he works for the division newspaper.
Malden was already a kind of a fledgling artist, and I think he joined the National Guard to have enough money so he could eat.
He even strikes up a friendship with the editor of the local newspaper, the Watertown Daily Times, which prints a few of his early cartoons.
At Pine Camp, my work began to take on some form and relevance.
His style of cartoon artwork would later be incorporated in his famous characters Willie and Joe, the bedraggled typical foxhole soldiers of World War II that he creates when the 45th Division is sent to Italy. In 1944, Bill begins working for Stars and Stripes, a large independently produced newspaper for military and government personnel serving overseas. In his career, he goes on to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the highest of journalism awards. His political cartoons are printed internationally from the 1950s until his retirement in 1991. Bill passed away in 2003 at the age of 82. By July of 1943, Pine Camp is home to another division. The 5th Armored trains at the post through the fall.
When they say you're going to New York, boy, us guys, we thought, hey, this is going to be great. First town I went to was Black River. It was a different world, and it was cold. They didn't ask you, would you want to be anything? They said, you're going to be a tank driver. Well, I got a driver's license from a motorcycle to a tank.
The The 5th Armored trains at the post through the fall when 1,000 soldiers travel to areas of central New York to provide needed manpower to pick the local apple crop. During this time, a series of gas pumps to fuel up the lines of tanks are built along a wide avenue that will become known as Gasoline Alley. By February of 1944, the division is shipped out to Europe and fights with the 4th Armored Division as part of Patton's 3rd Army Group in France following the D-Day landings. By the time the 5th Armored Division leaves Pine Camp, Italian prisoners of war are coming in to be interned from the North Africa and Sicily campaigns. The first trainload of prisoners arrives in September 1943. Bringing around 1,000 Italian POWs to the camp stockade located near a railhead towards the village of Black River. Considered gaunt when first taken prisoner in Sicily, Italian POWs are said to have gained 15 to 35 pounds in several months, many claiming to have not had much meat or butter for 4 years. One American soldier guarding them in 1943 describes the prisoners.
"They're not hard guys. I talk to them. They're happy and safe here, they tell me, but they get a little homesick."
Italian prisoners enjoy more freedom as Italy turns from a foe to an American ally in 1943. They're given weekend passes into the nearby city of Watertown to go to the movies and restaurants. Many join Italian service units performing non-combat tasks for the U.S. Army. In May of 1944, the first German POWs arrive at Pine Camp. Many are trucked to other locations or branch camps for use as day laborers. These locations range through central, western, and northern New York State. They're paid 10 cents an hour to pick fruits and vegetables, work in canneries, help on local farms, work as lumberjacks, or even shovel snow. On the western edge of the Adirondacks, a group of German POWs cutting pulpwood for the St. Regis Paper Corporation become uncooperative and refuse to work. The ringleaders are sent to the stockade for 30 days, while the others are confined for 2 days. Another group of 70 POWs are brought to the city of Utica in central New York State to pick peas, issue a demand to remain outdoors in their compound until 10 p.m. or they'll go on strike. The demands are not granted, and the following day they go on strike. The prisoners received solitary confinement for 30 days with bread and water issued for only half of their time. For most POWs, escaping is pointless. One German prisoner located in western New York simply states, "Where would we go?" However, escapes are occasionally attempted. A German corporal manages to walk away from a branch camp located in northern New York, but his escape is cut short as he's recaptured within 24 hours. By war's end, there are nearly 500,000 German, Italian, and Axis prisoners held throughout 640 POW camps in the United States. Although the exact number of POWs housed at Pine Camp is unknown, the last group of 250 Germans leaves the post in May of 1946 to return home. Some do not survive to get that opportunity. 6 German POWs and 2 Italian prisoners die from illness, natural causes, and accidents. German POWs, angered by the surrender of Italy to the Allies, refuse to have their comrades buried next to the graves of Italian prisoners. They are buried separately in the Loraysville Cemetery on post, except for one of the Italian prisoners who drowned while swimming at a recreation area. His family ships his body back to Italy following the end of the war. During the Second World War, while Pine Camp has its own history taking place, another division is established on the other side of the country. The 10th Mountain Division forms at Camp Hale, Colorado in 1943 and is made up of expert ski troops and mountaineers. They proved themselves in action, fighting the Italian mountaintop battles of Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere, before advancing across the Po Valley and ending the war in the Lake Garda region of the Alps. Following the war, the division is disbanded, but does not fade into history. The 10th Mountain Division and Pine Camp will cross paths 40 years later. Following the surrender of Germany and Japan ending World War II,
on December 10th, 1947, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, a fire watch came out of one of the adjacent barracks. He noticed that there were flames leaping from the second-story windows of the barracks. 10 men had jumped from the building. 4 of them were found dead in their bunks. Everyone in the barracks was an officer. Captain Francis Turner woke up his fellow officers. He had suffered over 90% of his body burned. He did not die from his injuries until 18 days later. In result of the families of the deceased suing the United States Army for wrongful death, it eventually got to the Supreme Court. They sided with the lower courts, which had thrown the cases out, basically saying that the United States service member had a special relationship with the government, and under the Federal Tort Claims Act, they did not have the right to sue for wrongful death. This decision became known as the Ferez Doctrine, which was named after Lieutenant Rudolph Ferez, who was one of the deceased. Every service member since 1947 has had this relationship under this doctrine.
Pine Camp continues its use by National Guard and Reserve units, including paratroop training.
We were supposed to learn to train for all different climates. They issued us skis in the wintertime, and they had a hill over there that we had to go over and learn to ski on. That was comical to watch them get out there and try to stand up on skis. They was on the ground more than they was on the skis.
It is during this time that the post experiences another kind of battle, and this time it's not mock warfare. In August of 1949, a huge wildfire rages out of control across the artillery range. An alert is issued to the 150 residents of the nearby hamlet of Spragueville to prepare for evacuation. Dense smoke hangs in the air over nearby villages as the fire sweeps across 10 square miles of the post. Guardsmen and military firefighters use bulldozers to fight the blaze. The range area and over 20 abandoned buildings are destroyed. The fire is eventually brought under control, and nearby residents breathe a sigh of relief that they'll not need to evacuate their homes. As the 1950s come about, Pine Camp is soon to have a name change. Lieutenant General Hugh A. Drum, who had ordered the Pine Camp enlargement project in the 1940s, retires from the Army and becomes president of the Empire State Building Corporation. It's October 3, 1951. While sitting at his desk on the 32nd floor, Hugh Drum suffers a heart attack and dies at age 72. On December 6, 1951, Pine Camp is renamed Camp Drum in honor of the general whose planning and foresight had made the training area into a division-sized post. The official ceremony is held August 22, 1952, with Drum's widow Mary present for the dedication. As the Korean War drags into a stalemate in its second year, a major winter training operation is planned for Camp Drum. Observing the exercise, General Mark Clark, Chief of Army Ground Forces and Commander of the 1st Army. Exercise Snowfall covers 600 square miles of northern New York and involves up to 30,000 troops and airmen like the large-scale pre-World War II maneuvers. This time, however, the realism proves tragically fatal for a number of men involved in the operation. On January 30th, 4 groups of parachutists from the 11th Airborne Division, numbering some 2,000 men, drop in the 15-degree temperature from C-119 transport aircraft nicknamed Flying Boxcars. The casualties for the first day among the jumpers: 1 dead, 33 injured, 13 of them in serious condition. Ground maneuvers continue over the next week, but on February 8th, another paratrooper is killed when his main and reserve chutes become tangled. The deadliest day of training is Sunday, February 10th. A C-46 transport plane attempts to take off from Wheeler-Sac Airfield with a load of paratroopers. It catches its wing on the runway and suddenly veers off, crashing into a row of parked planes and a bulldozer. The cockpit is severed from the plane, resulting in the immediate death of 3 of the flight crew, including the pilot. A 4th dies in the hospital that night. Although the cargo hold sustains minor damage, there are 18 injuries among the paratroopers. At the same time, another parachutist is found dead on the ground, either killed by the hard landing on frozen ground or struck by equipment dropped along with the men. The day is still not over. A convoy of trucks driving near the village of Antwerp go over a rail crossing, and one of the vehicles is hit by a New York Central freight train, smashing the truck, killing 2 men and damaging a telephone pole, knocking out service to the area. By the time Exercise Snowfall comes to an end, 9 soldiers have been killed and over 150 have been injured. The 17-day exercise proves to be valuable wintertime training. Throughout the remainder of the 1950s and into the 60s, Camp Drum continues to be used by Reserve and National Guard units honing their skills. Some of the units' training include the 26th Yankee Division from Massachusetts, the 42nd Rainbow Division, and the 77th Liberty Division, both from the New York City area, and the 78th Lightning Division from New Jersey. By the 1970s, the base is home to an air-to-ground gunnery range used by Air National Guard units, including the 174th from Syracuse, New York. It is during this time 2 pilots of the 174th, Captain Richard Monson and Captain Richard Havner, are both killed when each of their A-37B Dragonfly fighter planes crashed during training missions. In 1974, Camp Drum is changed to Fort Drum in an attempt to assign a large unit to be housed at the base.
I signed in at Camp Drum in early September of 1974, and within a month or so, it changed to Fort Drum. And nothing really changed outside the sign at the gate and the letterhead. You couldn't tell a bit of difference. It was a pretty small place. There were 200 soldiers in the garrison here. That was it, 200 total. So you got to know everybody, and it was a tight little family. In the summertime back then, it was pretty hectic. We used to get 85,000 National Guard and Reserve soldiers coming through here every summer. Come Memorial Day, things just kicked into high gear. And at Labor Day, it's signed off like a light switch going off. That last 2-week rotation of National Guard Reserve soldiers pulled out of here in early September. You came back on Monday morning, the place was just altogether different. It was almost like a ghost town. So the winter was very slow, and we do our work planning for the next summer training rotation, and that was the mission of Fort Drum, National Guard and Reserve training. We'd see a couple winter training exercises, not every year. Some of the bigger ones were pretty impressive. I'm talking 11,000, 12,000 soldiers coming in here for 3 weeks in January. Marines, Army from down south, some would parachute in here from Fort Bragg. In the latter part of the 70s, the Army went through quite a rebuilding period in so many ways, in terms of the morale and character of the soldiers and equipment. The Army was tired from Vietnam, and it took a while to put the pieces back together again, and some of that took place here.
During the early 1980s, the Army created a concept called the Light Infantry Division. Back then we had 2 types of divisions. We had armored mechanized divisions intended to fight in Europe, and airborne or air assault divisions. The armored mechanized divisions could do a lot of fighting, but the problem was they were big and heavy and slow to move. And the airborne guys, you could put them in an airplane and fly them out to anywhere in the world in about 12 hours, but then they didn't have anything to fight with once they got there. So the Army realized, we need a unit somewhere in between that has a little more combat power, but is still light enough that we can deploy it throughout the world pretty quickly. And as a result, they came up with this Light Infantry Division concept. A number of these were established, and Fort Drum was chosen as one of those locations.
In 1984, the Army announces it's forming a new division that will be part of the 18th Airborne Corps. The 10th Light Infantry Division is activated, and Fort Drum will become their home. It is to be the first new regular Army division formed in nearly a decade, and also the first based in the Northeast since World War II.
They were a new unit that was activated during the 1980s, but they soon took the name of the famed World War II unit, the 10th Mountain Division.
On February 14, 1985, 3,000 people attend a reactivation ceremony in the hangar at Wheeler-Sac Airfield at Fort Drum. Attending the event is World War II and 10th Mountain Division veteran Bob Dole, at the time a senator from Kansas. Dole had suffered shrapnel injuries to his right arm while in Italy serving with the 10th Mountain Division in 1945. Bob Dole went on to become the Republican presidential candidate in the 1996 election, losing to Bill Clinton. Deactivated since 1958, the unit colors of the 10th Mountain Division are passed on to the new commander, Brigadier General William Carpenter. Carpenter was known as the Lonesome End while playing football with the Army West Point team, the Black Knights, in 1958 and 1959. He earned the nickname Lonesome End as the result of a decoy tactic of leaving him outside of the huddles near the sidelines. Carpenter was named All-American in 1959. He was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 1982. After graduation from West Point, he served several tours of duty in Vietnam. He earned a Silver Star and later a Distinguished Service Cross. Now in 1985, he's tasked with the largest Army construction project since World War II.
He had a pretty overwhelming mission when you think about it. He had to build a new installation to house this new division. He also had to form the new division, which was, it was not only new physically, it was a new concept of division. I mean, there had never been a light infantry division before. He was forming a whole new thing in terms of the Army, in terms of the structure. He also had to construct the installation to handle that.
How we're going to bring a 10,000 soldier division on board and at the same time build a city in the middle basically of the woods of upstate New York and get this all done in 3 years. Because the Department of Defense had determined that by 1988 they wanted the division ready for deployment.
Fort Drum was here and had been here for a long time. We basically had to totally build a new installation on top of the old post.
With a budget of nearly $1.3 billion, 130 new buildings, 35 miles of roadway, and over 4,000 sets of family housing are built between 1986 and 1992. It's the newest military base in the world.
The Army had not gone anywhere inside the continental United States and built a $1 billion post from scratch all at once. Every other post in the Army inside the United States has been built over the years.
The community leaders and Army leaders really worked together, and there was always a close linkage between the Army and the community.
The very first concept for the new Fort Drum had a north-south orientation.
As we laid it out on a piece of paper, we had a major and the engineers who kept looking at it and said, there's a reason in 1941 they built this thing the way they did. And he thought about it and thought about it, and finally he built a little mock-up and put it in a wind tunnel and had little styrofoam things that would look like snow, and he blew them through the old area and he blew them through the new area, which was perpendicular to the old area. Guess what? The prevailing winds on the old area blew the snow away on the main thoroughfares and blocked it on the angle streets. The way we were going to build it, we would have blocked all the main streets and left the angle streets open.
The old Fort Drum with an east-west orientation was done that way specifically because of the wind patterns and the snow removal. I mean, it was so that the snow would blow off the streets rather than onto the streets.
Those guys weren't dumb when they built the old post. Let's build on what they learned.
That was a major consideration in the design of the current Fort Drum, which is also an east-west orientation.
They basically designed an installation around an outer ellipse, and then they moved it inward. In the very center is the division headquarters. Then you get to your brigade headquarters, your battalion headquarters, then your troop barracks, then your mess halls, then your motor pools where you do all your maintenance and things. In the center of the post was the common use areas where you have theaters and commissary. And then on the southern end of the post, your housing, where you put your families and stuff. All of it serviced by an outer ring has moved into inner rings, the inner ring 10K. So because soldiers had to pass the 10K marching test by time in a 40-pound rucksack, and so we designed it that way.
Wheeler Sac Army Airfield also undergoes improvements. New hangars and support facilities, a new control tower, and in 1998, a 10,000-foot runway is completed, allowing any size aircraft in the world to land there. Also finished is the rapid deployment facility for processing outgoing and arriving troops from aircraft transports. Throughout the 90s, soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division practiced the art of warfare with live fire exercises, field maneuvers, helicopter assault techniques, medevac training, testing new equipment and weapon systems, and all-weather operations. During this time, the 10th Mountain puts its training to use. Numerous units are deployed to the Middle East to fight Iraqi forces in the first Gulf War. provide disaster relief in southern Florida following Hurricane Andrew, help the distribution of relief supplies to civilians in Somalia, restore the elected government in Haiti, and keep the peace in Bosnia and Kosovo. In addition to serving the soldiers of the 10th, Fort Drum also continues to be used as a training ground for Reserve and National Guard units from the Northeast. The air-to-ground gunnery range is used for practice by numerous Air National Guard units,
which drew in all sorts of aircraft, mainly Syracuse, Connecticut, Massachusetts. It drew in a whole lot of aircraft. We've had Navy aircraft come up to use the range, but the important part of that was recognizing the fact that you had a full active duty division training, you had Guard training in the summertime, you had Navy training in the summertime, so you had all of this total force was always training, but it was never integrated. Because we had all these pieces, we started to integrate them in the summer training and became real-time exercises. It was one of the areas that probably promoted total force concept and actually did it and trained with it, experimented with different tactics. There were a lot of other places in the country that were trying to do that and do it also, but this was one of the premier sites that combined arms training. But it was done in real time, real pieces, talking, integrating with each other, and running total force exercises on a continuous basis. Now everybody talks together, the same communication pieces, the same networks. So total force is now just a seamless way we do life. But Fort Drum was extremely important and one of the premier sites to actually test it and to make it work and make it happen.
Following the September 11th attacks, units of the 10th Mountain Division are once again deployed overseas, this time to Afghanistan. Units rotate in as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. Soldiers engage with Taliban and al-Qaeda terrorists in the eastern part of the country, killing and capturing hundreds of enemy insurgents. They also capture thousands of weapons and tons of ammunition. In March of 2003, Fort Drum suffers its worst single training accident. A Black Hawk helicopter carrying 13 soldiers crashes on post, killing 11 men, including the pilots. In 2004, 10th Mountain Division units begin rotating into northern Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. They patrol the area, providing security for the region, and train Iraqi police and army units. Soldiers also provide assistance to the civilian population. These overseas deployments incorporate the training soldiers receive back at Fort Drum. An urban warfare village provides situations the troops will encounter in Afghanistan. The base also offers the newest technology in virtual battlefield and weapons simulations. Another virtual trainer is a multi-million-dollar Black Hawk flight simulator mounted on hydraulic lifts, mimicking the motion of flying. Fort Drum continues to grow as hundreds of millions of dollars are spent annually to build new facilities and upgrade aging ones. 33,000 soldiers and their dependents are now in Drum country, and the number continues to grow. Driving around Fort Drum, it's apparent that history and Army lineage play an important role in the lives of the soldiers there. The roadways and buildings are named with battles, locations, and personalities from Army history. McGrath Gym is named after a Medal of Honor winner in the 10th Mountain Division, John McGrath, killed in action in World War II. McGrath single-handedly knocked out several German machine gun nests, killing and wounding additional German soldiers before being mortally wounded by mortar and artillery fire. The Ernest Childers Indoor Weapons Training Facility is named in memory of the first Native American to win the Medal of Honor. He trained at Pine Camp while serving with the 45th Division and was awarded for his action while serving in World War II in Italy. The Mark Clark Soldier Support Center is named for the famous general of World War II in Korea, who was born only a short distance from the base. The former Pine Plains Fitness Center has been renamed the Monty Fitness Center for the 10th Mountain Division's 2nd Congressional Medal of Honor winner, Sergeant Jared Monty. Staff Sergeant Jared C. Monty is given the award posthumously by President Obama in a ceremony with Monty's family at the White House September 17, 2009. While serving with the 3rd Brigade Combat Team in Nuristan Province, Afghanistan, on June 21, 2006, his 16-man unit was attacked by some 50 Taliban fighters, and in the ensuing fight he was killed after repeated attempts to rescue a wounded soldier. What's happened to the old post of Fort Drum? Many of the multicolored World War II-era buildings are being torn down to make room for new construction, with only about half of the old cantonments still standing. The 3 buildings on Division Hill that made up the headquarters of the 4th Armored Division were demolished in 2007. The imposing hill, called the Hogsback from Drum's early years, was scooped away for building material to create the new Fort Drum. The characteristic orange and white check water towers will soon be gone, replaced with new structures. The new Fort Drum continues to build on the aging remains of its past. One name that's on no street sign or building is the officer who first picked out the site for what would become Fort Drum. In a bit of historical irony, the colonel who picked out the location of the future Fort Drum, Philip Reed, had under his command the man who would become the namesake of the Army base. Captain Hugh Drum was stationed under Reed at Sackett's Harbor's Madison Barracks in 1906 as a member of the 23rd Infantry.
I always had the impression that Colonel Reed should have had notoriety because he was the one that selected the site. It's ironic that he was never given some kind of an honor for what he did.
Fort Drum became the poster child for the Department of Defense on how new installations should be built.
Fort Drum is still the newest, most modern military installation anywhere in America, and probably anywhere in the world.
History has shown that the United States needs a prepared military force ready at a moment's notice. The world is an unpredictable place, and as long as troops are put into the fight, bases like Fort Drum are essential in keeping soldiers trained to be on the forefront of modern warfare.